The resignation letter trembled in Marcus Williams's weathered hands, the department letterhead stark against his dark skin. 15 years of service reduced to 3 paragraphs of carefully worded surrender. Through his patrol car's windshield, he watched the sun climb over the city he'd sworn to protect, painting the morning sky in hues of orange and pink that seemed to mock the darkness in his heart. His finger traced the blank line at the bottom of the page where his signature belonged. Each stroke reminded him of the day his father had proudly pinned the badge on his chest, tears glistening in the old man's eyes. "You're going to change things from the inside, son," he had said. Now, a decade and a half later, Marcus wondered if anything had changed at all. The laptop mounted to his dashboard chirped with incoming messages, reports of routine traffic stops, domestic disputes, and petty crimes scrolled past. The usual morning symphony of a city waking up. But it was yesterday's incident that kept playing in his mind. The whispered racial slur from a fellow officer during roll call, the uncomfortable silence that followed, and the lieutenant's practiced ignorance of the whole thing. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife. "Shanice, did you do it yet?" The message carried the weight of countless dinner conversations, of nights spent debating whether staying on the force was worth the toll it took on his spirit. Their teenage son had started asking questions too. "Why do you keep working with people who don't want you there, Dad?" Marcus picked up his pen, the metal cool against his palm. One signature and he could walk away, find a security job in the private sector, maybe even start his own business like Shanice had been suggesting. The pen's tip touched the paper, a small dot of ink bleeding into the fibers. That's when the call came in. "All units, we have reports of shots fired at Eleanor Roosevelt High School. Multiple casualties reported. Suspect believed to be still on premises." Marcus's hand froze. Roosevelt High was where his nephew studied. The resignation letter fluttered to the passenger seat as he grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Williams. I'm 3 blocks from Roosevelt. Responding code 3. Across town, Officer James Sullivan was sitting in his own patrol car, staring at his phone's screen where his brother's face filled the local news website. "Officer suspended for misconduct against minority suspect." The headline burned into his retinas, each word a hot coal of shame. Mike had always been the family hothead, but James had never thought he'd cross that line. Their mother's voice echoed from their last conversation. "You need to talk to your brother, Jimmy. This job is changing him, and not for the better." But how could he reach someone who didn't want to be reached? Mike had been spewing increasingly radical views at family dinners, making everyone uncomfortable with his us versus them rhetoric. The same alert about Roosevelt High crackled over James's radio. He was about to respond when his phone rang, Mike's number flashing on the screen. His brother's timing had always been terrible. James declined the call and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, Officer Sullivan responding to Roosevelt High." As his sirens wailed to life, James caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back at him seemed older than its 32 years, lined with the weight of his brother's choices and his own silent complicity. He tried to stay neutral, to keep the peace in the department and in his family. But neutrality was starting to feel like betrayal. The morning traffic parted before his patrol car like a river around a stone. His mind raced faster than his vehicle, processing tactical scenarios for an active shooter situation. But underneath the professional calculations, a voice whispered uncomfortable questions. Would he hesitate if the shooter was white? Would he react differently if they were black? Was he carrying his brother's biases without even knowing it? As both officers sped toward Roosevelt High from opposite ends of the city, neither knew they were racing toward a moment that would strip away all these questions, all their doubts and preconceptions. In less than an hour, the only colors that would matter would be the red of blood and the blue of the uniforms they wore. The school's silhouette appeared on the horizon, its brick walls glowing in the morning sun. Marcus arrived first, his tires crunching over the empty parking lot's gravel. As he pulled up, something felt wrong. No panicked students fleeing the building. No sounds of chaos. just an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. James's patrol car rounded the corner seconds later, and their eyes met briefly through their windshields. In that moment, they were neither black nor white. Just two cops walking into the unknown, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons as a child's scream pierced the morning air. The resignation letter lay forgotten on Marcus's passenger seat, the dot of ink marking where history had almost taken a different turn. The scream hung in the air like shattered glass, sharp and dangerous. Marcus drew his weapon with practiced precision, years of training condensing into muscle memory. Through his earpiece, he heard dispatch attempting to reach other units, but only static answered. He tapped his radio. Dead. 20 yards away, James emerged from his patrol car, gun already drawn. Their eyes met again, longer this time, an unspoken protocol passing between them. Without words, they established their positions, Marcus taking the main entrance while James covered the emergency exit. It was the textbook approach, yet something felt wrong about the whole scene. "Where are the teachers?" Marcus muttered, scanning the vacant parking lot. Morning attendants should have filled these spaces with cars, the sidewalks with stragglers rushing to first period. Instead, there was only emptiness, broken by the gentle flutter of papers caught in the morning breeze. James's mind raced through similar observations. No shell casings on the ground, no broken windows, no signs of panic. Everything that should accompany an active shooter situation was absent. He'd responded to enough calls to know what chaos looked like. This wasn't it. This was orchestrated. Another scream echoed, this time from deeper within the building. But something about it seemed off. A slight mechanical distortion, as if played through speakers. Marcus caught it too, his posture shifting subtly. Their eyes met again, and this time both saw the same realization. They were walking into something much different than a school shooting. "Officer Williams," Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice carrying across the empty lot. Professional courtesy demanded acknowledgement before entering a high-risk situation together. "Officer Sullivan," James responded, matching the formality. They'd passed each other in the precinct hallways dozens of times, but this was their first real interaction. Funny how it took a potential crisis to break down the invisible walls between them. They approached the main entrance in tandem, their movements synchronized by years of similar training. The school's security door was already unlocked. Another red flag. Marcus reached for the handle, pausing only briefly to glance at his watch. 10:17 a.m. He'd remember that time later, marking the moment everything changed. The school's lobby greeted them with fluorescent lights and more silence. Trophy cases lined the walls, teenage accomplishments frozen behind glass. A banner celebrating the upcoming homecoming dance hung limply overhead, its cheerful colors at odds with the tension in the air. "Clear left," Marcus called softly, sweeping his sector. "Clear right," James responded, moving in perfect complement. They proceeded down the main hallway, passing empty classrooms with doors standing wide open. No students huddled under desks, no teachers shepherding their charges to safety. The entire building felt like a stage set, waiting for actors who never arrived. A flicker of movement caught James's eye, a shadow passing quickly across a window at the end of the hall. He signaled to Marcus, who nodded in acknowledgement. They moved forward, their boots silent on the polished floor. Suddenly, the building's PA system crackled to life. Both officers froze, weapons trained on the corridor ahead. Officers Williams and Sullivan. A digitally distorted voice filled the hallway. "Welcome to today's lesson in brotherhood." The sound of heavy metal doors slamming echoed through the building. Fire doors began descending from the ceiling at various points along the corridor, their mechanical whir growing louder as they dropped. "Move," Marcus shouted, but it was too late. A door slammed down between them, cutting the hallway in half. James spun around just in time to see another door sealing off his retreat. They were trapped in separate sections of the corridor, able to see each other only through the door's narrow reinforced window. "You've both been carefully chosen," the voice continued, an edge of cruel amusement in its artificial tone. Officer Williams, the dedicated minority cop, still believing he can change the system from within. And Officer Sullivan, the white knight with a racist brother, trying so hard to prove he's one of the good ones. Marcus slammed his fist against the fire door, but it didn't budge. Through the window, he could see James trying his radio again, desperation creeping into his movements. "Don't bother with your radios or phones," the voice taunted. "We've made sure you're completely cut off. It's just the two of you now, and soon we'll find out if the thin blue line is really colorblind." A faint hissing sound began emanating from the ventilation system. James noticed it first, his eyes widening as he recognized the subtle chemical smell. Through the window, he watched Marcus's expression change too, the recognition of a soldier who'd encountered something similar before. "Gas," Marcus mouthed silently, just as the PA system crackled one final time. "Let the experiment begin." The gas crept through the ventilation system like a ghostly serpent, its faint green tinge visible in the fluorescent lighting. Marcus immediately pulled his shirt over his nose, his military training kicking in. Through the window, he could see James doing the same, their eyes meeting in shared understanding of the growing danger. "Keep your breathing shallow," Marcus shouted through the door, his voice muffled but urgent. "If it's what I think it is, we've got maybe 5 minutes before it hits hard." His mind flashed back to chemical weapons training in the Army, the burns, the convulsions, the gasping victims. He pushed the memories away, focusing on the present. James nodded, already scanning his section of the corridor for anything useful. The school's emergency equipment caught his eye. A fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, a first aid kit, and his heart jumped. A maintenance closet. "I've got a door here," he called out, moving toward it while keeping his shirt pressed against his face. The PA system crackled again, the distorted voice now carrying a note of amusement. "Interesting, isn't it? How quickly humans revert to helping each other when death is in the air. But Officer Sullivan, ask yourself, would you try this hard to save him if he looked more like the people your brother hates?" James ignored the taunt, his hands working the closet's lock. His head was starting to swim, the gas effects already taking hold. The lock finally gave way, revealing shelves of cleaning supplies, tools, and there, an industrial fan. "I've got something," he shouted, dragging the fan out. "Maybe we can push some of this gas back." Meanwhile, Marcus was fighting his own battle. The gas seemed thicker in his section, purposefully so, he realized. They weren't just trying to kill two cops, they were orchestrating a specific scenario. His vision blurred as he searched for anything to help their situation. A ceiling vent caught his attention, and beneath it, a teacher's desk. "They wanted this," Marcus called out, his voice growing hoarse. "They're not just hate-mongers, they're playing a bigger game." He began dragging the desk beneath the vent, each movement becoming more difficult as the gas took its toll. James had managed to get the fan running, but the gas was too pervasive. His eyes burned, and his movements were becoming uncoordinated. Through the window, he watched Marcus climbing onto the desk, reaching for the vent. "What are you thinking?" he called out. "These systems." Marcus paused, coughing violently. "They're usually connected above the fire doors. If I can get this vent open." His fingers fumbled with the screws. "Maybe we can." His sentence cut off as a wave of dizziness hit him. The screwdriver slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor as he swayed dangerously on the desk. "Marcus," James shouted, forgetting formality in the moment of crisis. He watched in horror as his fellow officer struggled to maintain balance. The gas was definitely thicker on Marcus's side, another calculated move by their tormentors. The PA system came to life once more. "Officer Sullivan, you have a choice to make. Behind the painting to your left is a wall safe. Inside is a single gas mask. The code is your brother's badge number. Yes, we know everything about both of you. Will you use it to save yourself, or will you find a way to save Officer Williams?" The clock is ticking. James's vision swam as he looked at the painting, a generic landscape that had probably hung there for years. Behind him, he heard Marcus collapse from the desk, hitting the floor hard. Through the window, he could see him struggling to get up, the gas taking its toll. With trembling hands, James ripped the painting from the wall. The safe was there, its keypad glowing mockingly. His brother's badge number. The same one he'd memorized as a kid, dreaming of following in Mike's footsteps. Now it felt like poison in his mind. "Your brother always said they're not worth saving," the voice taunted. "Prove him right. Save yourself." James looked back at Marcus, who was now on his hands and knees, fighting for consciousness. Their eyes met through the window. And in that moment, James saw beyond color, beyond badge numbers, beyond all the artificial barriers that had kept them apart in the precinct. He saw a fellow officer, a father, a human being. His fingers moved across the keypad, entering the numbers that could save a life, though not necessarily his own. The safe clicked open just as his legs began to give way, the gas finally overwhelming his system. As his consciousness faded, one thought crystallized in his mind. Some choices transcend training, transcend prejudice, transcend everything they teach you at the academy. Some choices define not just who you are, but who you always wanted to be. The gas mask felt heavy in James's trembling hands as his vision tunneled. Through the reinforced window, Marcus had stopped moving. His body crumpled on the floor beside the fallen desk. The voice's words echoed in James's fading consciousness. "Prove him right. Save yourself." Instead, he crawled toward the fire door, each movement a battle against his failing muscles. The mask rattled against the floor as he dragged it with him. His brother's voice invaded his thoughts, memories of countless family dinners where Mike had spewed his poison about them and us. But looking at Marcus now, James saw neither them nor us. He saw the photo on Marcus's desk at the precinct, his wife, his kids, his nephew who went to this very school. "Fascinating choice, Officer Sullivan," the mechanical voice crackled overhead. "But how do you plan to save him when you can barely save yourself? The door won't budge, and you're running out of time." James reached the fire door, pressing his face against the small window. Marcus lay just a few feet away on the other side, but it might as well have been miles. The gas was thicker now, its greenish hue almost beautiful in its deadliness. His lungs burned with each breath, and darkness crept at the edges of his vision. The fire extinguisher he'd noticed earlier caught his eye again. Through the chemical haze in his brain, a desperate plan formed. He'd seen Marcus trying to access the ventilation system. If the passages were connected above the doors. "Your brother always said compassion was weakness," the voice taunted. "That it would get you killed one day." Maybe he was right. James ignored the voice, focusing his remaining strength on one last effort. He crawled to the extinguisher, every movement an agony of burning muscles and spinning vision. His fingers closed around its cold metal surface just as another wave of dizziness hit him. "What would Mike think, Jimmy?" The voice continued, using his brother's nickname for him. His little brother, dying to save one of them. The extinguisher felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as James lifted it. His world had narrowed to this one task, this one moment. He thought of Marcus's resignation letter, glimpsed on his car seat through the window. How many good officers had they lost because of people like Mike? How many bridges had been burned by hate? Not this one. Not today. With his remaining strength, James swung the extinguisher at the ceiling vent above him. The metal grating buckled but held. He swung again, harder, feeling something pop in his shoulder. The grate crashed down, revealing the dark passage above. "Impressive," the voice mocked. "But what's your end game, Officer Sullivan? Even if you get the mask to him, you'll die from the exposure. Is that what you want? To leave your brother alone with his hate?" James's hand shook as he pulled the pin from the extinguisher. Basic physics. The pressure should be enough to send the mask through the ventilation system to Marcus's side. If he aimed it right. If the passages were truly connected. If. His lungs seized, and he doubled over, coughing violently. Blood speckled the floor beneath him. Through tears of pain, he looked at Marcus again. The rise and fall of his chest was barely visible now. "Last chance, Officer Sullivan," the voice said softly. "Put on the mask. Save yourself. Be the brother Mike always wanted you to be." James thought of Mike then. Not the angry man he'd become, but the big brother who taught him to ride a bike, who'd helped him study for the police exam, who'd pinned the badge on his chest at graduation. Somewhere inside that hatred was the brother he'd known. Maybe, just maybe, this moment could help bring him back. "I am being the brother he needs me to be," James whispered. He pressed the mask into the extinguisher's nozzle, wrapping it tight with his belt. His vision was almost gone now, his movements purely on instinct. With his last conscious thought, he aimed the extinguisher up into the vent and squeezed the handle. The pressurized spray shot upward, carrying the mask with it through the ventilation system. James collapsed, his body finally surrendering to the gas. As darkness took him, he heard a clang from Marcus's side, the mask dropping through the vent. "Well played, Officer Sullivan," the voice said, something different in its tone now. "But I wonder, was it worth it?" James couldn't respond. His world had faded to black, his last thought a prayer that Marcus would wake up in time to use the mask. That something good would come from his choice. That maybe, just maybe, his sacrifice would help heal more than just one divide. The gas continued to swirl around them both, its green tendrils dancing in the fluorescent light like aurora borealis, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Marcus's consciousness returned in fragments. First, sound, the hiss of gas through vents, the distant echo of that mechanical voice. Then sensation, the burning in his lungs, the cold floor against his cheek, and something hard pressing into his side. His fingers brushed against rubber and plastic, the gas mask. Through the window, he could make out James's motionless form on the other side. The fire extinguisher lay beside him, its white powder settling in the toxic air like snow. Understanding hit Marcus harder than any physical blow. James had chosen him over self-preservation. "Ah, Officer Williams, welcome back," the voice purred through the speakers. "Officer Sullivan made quite the sacrifice, didn't he? But don't waste too much time admiring his nobility. He's got about 3 minutes before brain damage sets in." Tick-tock. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled the mask over his face. Each breath of clean air cleared his mind, sharpening his focus. James had given him a chance. Now he had to make it count. He forced himself to his feet, swaying but determined. "What's your plan now, Officer Williams?" the voice asked. "The doors are still sealed. The gas is still flowing. Your white knight is dying. Perhaps this is cosmic justice for all those years of institutional racism." Marcus ignored the taunt, his military training taking over. He scanned his surroundings with new clarity, seeing what he'd missed before. The fire door's hydraulic mechanism at the top, the exposed electrical conduit running along the ceiling, the emergency lights blinking their steady rhythm. "You know what the statistics say," the voice continued. "How many white officers would do what he did for you? Why risk your life for one of them?" Marcus yanked the teacher's desk drawer open, finding what he needed. A stapler, heavy and metal. His uncle's words from years ago echoed in his mind. "Hate is easy, son. Humanity is harder." "Because that's not who we are," Marcus muttered, climbing onto the desk again. "That's not who we choose to be." He swung the stapler at the electrical conduit above him. Sparks showered down as the metal housing cracked. The emergency lights flickered. Again he struck. And again, each blow sending shocks of pain through his arms. "Interesting," the voice mused. "You think disrupting the power will release the doors? We're not amateurs, Officer Williams. The locks are fail-safe. No power means they stay sealed." Marcus smiled behind his mask. "Yeah," he said, striking one final time. "I'm counting on that." The conduit broke open, sending a surge through the system. The emergency lights flared brilliantly and died. In the darkness, Marcus heard what he'd been waiting for, the soft whir of the ventilation system shutting down. Without power, the gas would stop flowing. But James didn't have time to wait for it to clear. Marcus grabbed the broken conduit, yanking it free from the ceiling. The metal edge was sharp where it had broken. Sharp enough. "Very clever," the voice said, now running on backup power. "But Officer Sullivan has less than 2 minutes left. Even if you cut through the hydraulics, the door's too heavy to lift alone." Marcus jammed the conduit's edge into the hydraulic line above the door. "I'm not alone," he said, straining against the metal. "I've got a brother on the other side." The line burst, spraying hydraulic fluid across the hallway. Marcus braced himself against the door frame and pushed upward. The door budged an inch, then stuck. "Fascinating," the voice observed. "You're willing to risk your own life to save the brother of a man who hates everything you represent. Why?" Marcus's muscles screamed as he pushed harder. Another inch. "Because hate is a circle," he gasped. "Someone has to break it." The door lifted another inch, then began sliding up on its own. Marcus fell to his knees, exhausted but relieved. The backup generator had kicked in, overriding the failsafe. "Well done, Officer Williams," the voice said quietly. "But I'm afraid you're too late." Marcus crawled to James's side, pulling off his mask and pressing it to his fellow officer's face. "Come on, brother," he whispered, starting chest compressions. "Don't let them win. Don't let hate win." Each compression sent pain through his tired muscles, but Marcus didn't stop. In his mind, he sought every barrier, every prejudice, every moment of distrust that had kept them apart in the precinct. With each push on James's chest, he broke through another wall. "Live," Marcus commanded, refusing to give up. "Live so we can show them what real brotherhood looks like." In the distance, sirens finally began to wail. The wail of approaching sirens grew louder as Marcus continued CPR, each compression a defiant statement against the hate that had brought them here. James remained unresponsive, his skin taking on a bluish tinge that made Marcus's heart race faster. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, he muttered, the mantra keeping him focused. The gas mask lay between them, now shared in desperate rotation. 2 breaths for James, 1 quick gulp of filtered air for Marcus, then back to compressions. The remaining gas in the hallway burned his eyes and scratched at his lungs during the exposed moments. "How poetic," the mechanical voice observed, "giving him the very breath from your lungs. But tell me, Officer Williams, what will you say to his brother when he dies anyway? How will you face a grieving family who might blame your very existence for his death?" Marcus pressed harder, feeling a rib crack beneath his hands. "He's not dying," he growled. "Not today. Not like this." Sweat dripped from his forehead, mixing with tears of exertion and gas irritation. His world had narrowed to this one task, this singular mission of keeping James's heart beating. Through his burning eyes, Marcus caught movement at the end of the hallway. The SWAT team had arrived, their masked figures advancing cautiously through the haze. He could hear their radio chatter, their coordinated movements, but he didn't stop compressions. "Marcus," a familiar voice called out. Lieutenant Chen, his voice muffled by his protective gear. "Status. Officer down." Marcus shouted back, not breaking rhythm. "Need immediate medical, and get some fans in here to clear this gas." The SWAT team split, some securing the hallway while others rushed to assist. Marcus felt hands trying to pull him away, to replace him, but he shrugged them off. "I'm not leaving him," he said firmly. "He didn't leave me." Paramedics in hazmat suits arrived with their equipment, working around Marcus as he continued compressions. He heard snippets of their assessment: severe chemical exposure, cardiac arrest, possible neurological damage. But he filtered it out, focusing only on the movement of his hands. "You're fighting a losing battle," the voice taunted one final time before the SWAT team disabled the PA system. "Some divides can't be bridged." A paramedic touched Marcus's shoulder. "Sir, we need to take over. We have oxygen, medications." "Then work around me," Marcus interrupted, his voice hoarse but determined. "He gave up his chance at survival for me. I'm not stopping until this heart beats on its own." Time became fluid, measured only in sets of compressions. Marcus's arms felt like lead, his vision blurred, but he kept going. He barely registered the industrial fans being set up, the gradual clearing of the gas, the growing crowd of officers gathering at the hallway's ends. Then, beneath his hands, he felt it, a flutter, weak but present. One of the paramedics monitoring James called out, "We've got a pulse." Marcus sat back, finally allowing others to take over. He watched as they intubated James, attached monitors, started IVs. The numbers and lines on their equipment painted a picture of life clawing its way back from the brink. Lieutenant Chen knelt beside Marcus, now wearing just a filter mask. "You need medical attention too," he said gently. Marcus shook his head, his eyes fixed on James as the paramedics prepared to move him. "I'm going with him," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Marcus," Chen said, softer now, "we found the people behind this. They were watching everything through the school's security cameras, streaming it live. They wanted to show that when pushed to the extreme, racial divisions would prove stronger than the badge." Marcus finally looked at his superior, his eyes red but clear. "Then they failed," he said simply. "Because today, the only colors that mattered were the blue of our uniforms and the red of the blood we were both willing to shed." As they loaded James onto a stretcher, his fingers twitched, then slowly curled into a fist. Marcus reached out and clasped his hand, feeling a weak squeeze in return. James's eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain and confusion, but seeking something. "I got you, brother," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "You didn't let hate win, and neither did I." A tear rolled down James's cheek as he managed a small nod before slipping back into unconsciousness, but his hand kept its grip on Marcus's as they moved toward the exit, where the morning sun had burned away the last shadows of darkness. Behind them, the school hallway stood empty, its air clearing of poison, both chemical and ideological. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as the doors burst open. Marcus jogged alongside James's stretcher, still holding his hand, until a nurse firmly stopped him at the trauma bay entrance. "You need treatment too, officer," she said, noting his reddened eyes and labored breathing. "I'm fine," Marcus started to protest, but a violent coughing fit betrayed him. Through watering eyes, he watched James disappear behind a curtain, surrounded by medical staff calling out vital signs and orders. "Officer Williams," a deep voice cut through his haze. Dr. Reynolds, the head of emergency medicine, stood before him. "Let us help you both. Your partner needs you healthy." Partner. The word struck Marcus. In all his years on the force, he'd never truly had one. Had never wanted one. Too many risks, too many potential prejudices to navigate. Now, after one morning, the word felt right. In the adjacent trauma bay, Marcus finally submitted to treatment. Oxygen mask on his face, IV in his arm, monitors beeping their steady rhythm. But his eyes never left the curtain hiding James, watching the shadows of doctors moving urgently behind it. "BP dropping," a voice called out. "Starting pressors." Marcus tried to sit up, but firm hands held him down. Dr. Reynolds appeared between the bays, his face grave, his heart struggling with the chemical damage. "We need to get him on ECMO immediately." The doctor hesitated, then added, "We need blood type AB negative. It's rare, and our supply is low after a major accident this morning." Marcus pulled his oxygen mask off. "That's my type. Take what you need. You've already been exposed to toxic chemicals." The nurse protested. "You're not in any condition." "Take it," Marcus insisted. He gave up his air for me. I can give up some blood for him." The next hour passed in a blur of needle sticks and blood draws. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting the chemical exposure while compensating for the blood loss. Around him, he heard snippets of conversation, updates on James's condition, and a growing commotion in the hallway. He forced his eyes open to see Officer Chen standing in the doorway, looking troubled. "What's happening out there?" Marcus croaked. "Word got out," Chen said quietly, "about what happened at the school. About what you both did. There's a lot of officers here. From every precinct in the city." Marcus turned his head toward the window. In the parking lot below, a sea of blue uniforms had gathered. White officers, black officers, Asian officers, Hispanic officers, all standing together, many with their hands clasped in prayer. "They're all here for blood donation," Chen continued. "The line stretches around the building. Even officers who aren't AB negative are staying, just to show support." A commotion from James's bay drew their attention. Dr. Reynolds emerged, looking exhausted but satisfied. "He's stabilizing," he announced. "The ECMO is working, and his oxygen levels are improving. Your blood helped, Officer Williams, though it seems we won't be running short anytime soon." Marcus nodded, tears mixing with the residual chemical irritation in his eyes. "His brother. Has anyone contacted his brother?" Chen's expression darkened. "Mike Sullivan's here. He's been processing what happened, what his brother did, what you did." As if summoned by his name, a figure appeared in the doorway. Mike Sullivan looked nothing like the angry man from the news. His face was pale, his usual bravado replaced by something raw and vulnerable. "Officer Williams," he said, his voice rough. He trailed off, words failing him. Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Your brother's a hero," he said simply. "And he needs you to be one too." Mike's composure cracked. He took a stumbling step forward, then another, until he reached Marcus's bedside. Without warning, he grabbed Marcus's hand, the same way Marcus had held James. "I've been so wrong," Mike whispered. "So damn wrong. When they showed us the video feed, when I saw what Jimmy did, what you did," his grip tightened. "Teach me to be better. Please, help me understand what my brother already knows." Marcus squeezed his hand back, feeling the weight of this moment. Outside, the crowd of officers had begun singing. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." "We'll learn together," Marcus said softly. "That's what brothers do." In the next bay, James's monitors beeped steadily stronger, as if in agreement. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the podium in the Police Academy auditorium, his dress uniform crisp in the morning light. The graduation ceremony was minutes away, but his attention was fixed on the worn piece of paper in his hands. His resignation letter, never submitted, now yellowed at the edges. Still carrying that around, James appeared beside him, walking with just a slight limp, the last visible reminder of that day. His recovery had been long, but complete enough to return to active duty. Thinking of framing it, Marcus smiled, folding the letter and tucking it away. "Reminder of the day I almost gave up." The auditorium was filling quickly. In the front row, Mike Sullivan sat next to Marcus's family, chatting easily with Marcus's son about his upcoming ride-along program. The change in Mike over the past months had been remarkable. He'd become one of the department's most vocal advocates for community policing and racial sensitivity training. "Ready for this?" James asked, adjusting his tie. As keynote speakers, they were about to address the most diverse graduating class in the Academy's history. Applications from minority candidates had surged after their story went public. "Born ready," Marcus replied, then paused. "Though I still hate public speaking." "Just speak from the heart," James said, gripping his shoulder. "Like you did with my brother." The Academy commander approached the podium, calling for attention. The room fell silent except for the soft clicking of news cameras. Their story had become national news, but both officers had refused most interview requests. This moment, they'd decided, would be their first real public statement about what happened. Today's graduation is special, the commander began, not just because of our record-breaking class diversity, but because we have with us two officers who embodied the true meaning of our motto, to protect and serve. Officers Marcus Williams and James Sullivan. The applause was thunderous. Marcus took his place at the podium, James standing proudly beside him. He looked out at the sea of faces, the graduating cadets, their families, fellow officers, and in the back, some of the doctors and nurses who'd helped save their lives. 6 months ago, Marcus began, his voice strong and clear, I was ready to turn in my badge. I believed that some divisions couldn't be bridged, that some prejudices ran too deep. I was wrong. He gestured to James. My brother here taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. It's about seeing past the surface to the humanity beneath. James stepped forward, taking his turn at the microphone. What happened in that school was meant to prove that under pressure, we'd choose sides based on color. Instead, it proved that when everything else is stripped away, we're all the same underneath. We all bleed red. We all breathe the same air. Marcus pulled out his resignation letter one last time. To the graduating class, I want you to know something. There will be days when you question everything. Days when the weight of the badge feels too heavy. He tore the letter in half, then quarters. But remember this, your strength isn't in standing alone. It's in standing together. From the audience, Mike Sullivan stood up. Others followed, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause wasn't just for their heroism, but for what they'd come to represent. The possibility of change, the power of choice, the triumph of humanity over hate. We've established a new training program, James announced once the applause died down, called Beyond the Badge. It's not about protocols or procedures. It's about seeing each other, really seeing each other. Because that's where change begins, Marcus added, not in policies or programs, but in moments of choice, in deciding to see a partner instead of a color, a brother instead of a stranger. He paused, making eye contact with the cadets in the front row. Your uniform will be blue, but your blood, all of your blood, is red. Never forget that. The ceremony concluded with the traditional badge pinning, but this year was different. Instead of family members, the cadets had chosen to be pinned by officers of a different race than their own. Marcus pinned a badge on a young white cadet, while James did the same for a black recruit. Later, as they watched the new officers celebrating with their families, James turned to Marcus. Think we made a difference? Marcus watched Mike hugging his new black partner, saw the cadets mingling without regard to color, noticed how the old divisions in the department seemed to have faded like old photographs. We did, he said softly. But more importantly, we showed them how to make their own differences. Above them, the department's motto gleamed in brass letters, but everyone present knew the truth. Sometimes protecting and serving meant protecting and serving each other first.